In this video, we show how to replace the water pump and thermostat on the Porsche Boxster. We show which hoses to disconnect to drain the coolant, share how to fill and bleed coolant without a vacuum bleeder, share tips on common pitfalls, and make a few recommendations on what to do while you're in there to make your life easier in the future, like replacing the engine mount. I wasn't originally planning on replacing the thermostat, so an added benefit of this video is that we show how to replace the water pump and reach the bolts without removing the thermostat. We then also show how to replace the thermostat. Put the Boxster in hover mode, that is, on jack stands at all four corners. See my full-length guide for a simplified, step-by-step walkthrough on how to do this. Jack it up high enough to fit a large bucket underneath to hold all of the coolant. Put the Boxster in service mode and remove the inner engine cover, not the top one. Follow my step-by-step guide on how to enter service mode to achieve this. To remove the rear underbody panel, remove a few Torx T25 screws on the sides and 10mm plastic nuts in the middle. We're about to drain the coolant. In order to let it drain better, remove the coolant cap. The Boxster can hold up to 6 gallons of coolant, so get a bucket that can hold that amount and disconnect the small coolant hose from the water pump here and the large coolant hose from the thermostat here. First, use tongue and groove pliers to move the clamp onto the hose. This might take a bit of finessing and a bit of wrangling. You want to remove the hose from the water pump first in order to reach the clamp on the thermostat. It takes a bit of wrangling, but eventually they come off. Next, we want to completely remove the rubber hoses. The hoses are likely stuck on there. They are quite stubborn and also take some wrangling and finessing. I worked them loose with a flathead screwdriver, being careful not to puncture the rubber hoses. Eventually, they start dripping a little bit at first. Alternate between picking at them and pulling on them. Let the coolant drain for a bit so that it doesn't splash you while you're working. You can squeeze the hoses to force air into the system and convince more coolant to come out. Once I gave mine a few squeezes, coolant kept coming out. If you tilt the car at any point, more coolant might escape. Once the water pump hose has stopped draining, we can stop it up with a paper towel. Do the same technique on the thermostat rubber hose. First we remove the clamp, which you can see we have already done here, and then we push and pull. Push using a flathead screwdriver and pull using our hands. And let that drain. Place a 24mm socket on the tensioner here and turn clockwise. Making sure the 24mm socket doesn't slip off and suddenly release the tension, holding the wrench in place, carefully remove the belt off of any of the accessories, and slowly and carefully release the tension. Then, work the belt loose off of the rest of the accessories. If it's a simple water pump replacement, we can get away with not completely removing the belt and simply taking it off of the water pump, but we're replacing our belt while we're in here.
Pump has 2 at the bottom, and then the 1, 2, 3 are reachable from the top. So our objective is at least 3 of them, maybe hard ones from the bottom. We'll see if we can get this one from inside. Go from there. Gasket's pre-cut already. New bolts too. Longer bolts go onto the doweled ones, but we'll get to that shortly.
Okay, so if we bend the hose out of the way, you can see one pretty deep in there.
That one. On the right, that's going to be a little hard, but we'll get to it. 1, 2, 3. Should be from below. Three from the bottom. And sometimes they say it's easier to remove the passenger seat to fit in here to get the rest of the bolts, but I disagree. I don't think that's necessary. Careful not to cut yourself on the firewall. Oh, there we go, all 4. We got 3 of those from the bottom, and 1, 2, 3, 4 from the top. And on the new pump, 1, 2, 3 from below, 1, 2, 3, 4 from up top. So to get to this far bolt, this is too long. The long 10mm and the short 10mm is perfectly too short and interferes with it. The long one, and just barely interferes on that thing in the back. And the 10mm is barely too short because it doesn't reach because of the water thing. special small adapter to a small head. One of those keys off Amazon. Lets us break it loose with our thumb. And we have to play around with the length of 10mm. And it's loose, so now I'll just hand loosen it and get this bolt off, which is super easily accessible with a regular key, like so. As you loosen the last bolt on the water pump, coolant starts coming out the bottom as the seam starts opening up with the water pump on it. Water pump wants to fall off. We hold the water pump in, so we remove the last bolt. And don't cut your wrist on this because it's sharp and I almost did just now. Should be able to remove the water pump. Comes right off with its gasket, super easy. Oh.
The new water pump should come with a gasket and 7 bolts, 2 longer bolts and 5 shorter bolts. Remember those dowels from earlier? The water pump has 2 doweled holes for the longer bolts, and the other holes use the shorter bolts. Install the gasket onto the water pump, and then use a marker and mark the front of the bolt holes where the dowels are. This is where the longer bolts go. Underneath the car, we can put the water pump back into position, installing the shorter bolts into the unmarked holes, and installing the longer bolts into the marked holes. We hand tighten them in as much as we can, and then use swivels to get them in the rest of the way. We do not need a variety of crazy swivels in this situation. The hardest bolt is the farthest bolt to the right that we reach again from within, using our trick from before. This is basically a special low profile ratchet that doesn't have turning ability, so you have to turn it, take it off, and then turn it again. We play around and modify the length of this ratchet using adapters, since the socket is a 1/4 inch that we adapt to 3/8 of an inch, and that lets us vary the length. All links are available in the description to these adapters. Then we switch over to the 3/8 drive flat profile ratchet included in the kit and change the adapters there to get a bit more length out of it to finally tighten the bolt. The torque spec on these bolts is 10 Nm or 7 foot-pounds, but since there's almost no way a torque wrench will fit down there, we approximate it by hand. 7 foot-pounds is not a lot of force. And be very careful to not strip the engine block that you're bolting the water pump to.
Pretty easy. There's 1 E10, 2 E10, 3 E10, 4 E10, then it comes right out. Not a lot of torque at all. And mine did not come with new bolts. I'm gonna keep them in the same spots just because maybe they're different lengths. There's coolant coming out. Not bad at all. You hold it while undoing the last one by hand. And it should just pop right off. Voila. Not bad at all. So this is the low temperature thermometer that's going in. It opens at a lower temperature, causing more often cooling. Take our new thermometer. Make sure it's aligned, gasket is aligned. And we put the gasket onto the bolts. Turn all of them by hand. The gasket is warped, but it either leaks or it doesn't. You know, we will find out. So now we're incrementally tightening so that the gasket gets smushed evenly.
The torque spec on these bolts is 10 Nm or 7 foot-pounds, but since there's almost no way a torque wrench will fit down there, we approximate it by hand. 7 foot-pounds is not a lot of force. And be very careful to not strip the engine block that we're bolting the thermostat to. While the engine mount doesn't seem related to the water pump and thermostat, these two coolant hoses get in the way of replacing your engine mount. Therefore, while you're replacing your water pump and thermostat and have your coolant drained, it's strongly recommended to also remove these two coolant hoses in the center and replace your engine mount, which is directly above these two hoses. It might be possible to remove the engine mount without disconnecting the hoses on the previous generation Boxster, the 986. But on the 987, it has additional bolts, including a nightmare Torx screw, that you have to saw through and the hoses get in the way. Luckily, if you replace the engine mount now or later, thanks to these guides, it'll be straightforward to disconnect the coolant hoses if you need to do it later. To reattach the hoses, first we slip the old clamp back onto the hose.
Encourage the new pipe on.
Then we put the old clamp back on, making sure to put it on far enough and expanding it pretty wide such that it rests past the lips on the water pump and thermostat.
And out here. Likewise, this should go on relatively problem-free. There we go. Feel around because there's a lip and you want the hose to be over the lip and you want it clamped after the lip.
Now we're going to install the new belt onto the pulleys. It helps having a picture of how the old one went. We'll have a close-up shot shortly that you can use. Slide the belt onto most of the pulleys except the tensioner in the middle. Making sure the belt is securely seated on all the pulleys, that the ribs on the belt are lined up with the grooves on the pulleys, and it's not offset left or right by one groove. Apply pressure to the tensioner using the 24mm socket and slip the belt onto the tensioner. Being careful that the socket is well seated, and be careful with your fingers here.
So now that we have the belt most of the way on, I just want to slip it onto this ring here.
Holding it down. Make sure you're holding the tensioner pulley well and don't smush your fingers. Make sure this twists. And slowly but surely release. There we go, the new belt is on. Yep, make sure it's seated everywhere. You're good. In case you need another angle, it's around the water pump, on the alternator, around this pulley, making sure it's seated. Then it goes up over the power steering pump, making sure it's in the grooves. Around the air conditioner pulley, goes around, that's the main crankshaft there. This is me using the camera to also make sure it's fully aligned, yep. Down with the ribs facing up over the crankshaft, onto the tensioner pulley with the ribs facing up, back down and around the water pump. Cool, so all ribs, with the working components, all ribs are actually engaging with the thing, with the pulleys. Engaged, crankshaft engaged, and the belt isn't messed up anywhere. All right, and here's another look. So if you want to take a picture, there's one angle, here's another angle. There we go, that's a good angle. And water pump. With the car back on the ground, we can start doing the coolant fill.
Using our jacks and wooden blocks, lower the vehicle back on the ground. A vacuum bleeder is an $80 accessory that creates a vacuum in the system, sucks out air pockets, and helps suck in coolant. Some people swear by vacuum bleeders and say they're absolutely necessary. Others swear by them not being necessary. The Boxster and Cayman have a valve built in, specifically designed for bleeding air from the system. And there are people out there, including myself, who have successfully filled and bled the coolant system with zero issues using the built-in bleeder. In this video, we're about to fill and bleed the coolant using the built-in bleeder without having to purchase a vacuum bleeder. I'm going to allude to using coolant to fill the coolant system, but the first time around that I did this, I used distilled water and filled the system with water the first time around, and did the whole procedure twice to also, while doing this, get all of my old coolant out. So when you hear coolant, you might want to use distilled water the first time around to fill and bleed your system. Later, we will drain it all, and then do it again using real coolant. The procedure is simple. We will list the whole thing now to let you screenshot it, and then we show the procedure. I will also include this detailed guide in the description if you want to print the description out to have as a followable reference, because some of these steps move quickly. 1. Open the bleeder valve. To open the bleeder valve, remove the coolant cap, remove the oil cap, and remove the plastic panel underneath. Right after, reinstall the oil cap. Move this metal clip to the upwards position. This opens the bleeder valve. Get your Porsche OEM coolant and mix it in a 1:1 ratio with distilled water. 1 gallon of coolant and 1 gallon of distilled water makes 2 gallons of usable coolant. The pink fluid prevents freezing and has other properties. If you add too much, it won't cool properly. If you add too little, you run the risk of your coolant freezing in the winter. Don't worry about super specific ratios. These mismatches only happen if the ratios are totally out of whack. With the coolant mixed, get a flashlight and shine it on the coolant level. It's a little hard to see. Add coolant to the reservoir until it's at the max line. You should hear it bubbling and you should hear air escaping. We're almost ready to start it and bleed the system. If you have a manual transmission, skip ahead to the next step. If you have an automatic transmission, you will need a digital tool to electronically disable the cooler shutoff valve. On the 986, we could have pulled fuse B1, but on the 987, this fuse is D5 and is used for other vital functions and should not be pulled. Therefore, we will need a video that demonstrates how to disable the valve electronically. Here is a video that demonstrates how to disable the valve electronically. Start the 987 and turn on the heat to the max level. While it's idling, keep adding coolant back to the max level until the level stops dropping. This takes a minute or two and a refill or two. Give it a few revs, not too much, and add coolant if the level drops, back to the max level. Close the coolant cap, but leave the bleeder valve open. What I found is particularly helpful to success in bleeding air from the system without a vacuum pump is parking on a steep hill. Find a steep hill and park the 987 with the rear up. The hill should be steep enough, such that the reservoir is above the radiators. That will help force the coolant in and air out of the radiators. This is not required but is strongly encouraged for a better bleed. If you're unable to find a steep hill, then I recommend bleeding the air once without a steep hill, following the procedure as written here, and then repeating the procedure once you find a hill. With the car neutral, rev it to 2500 RPM for 10 minutes. Taking a break every 2 minutes to go back and check the coolant level is not below the minimum mark. If it is, add coolant by turning off the engine, waiting until the coolant cools down, and slowly and carefully remove the coolant cap and add coolant until the max line. If you don't wait long enough to open the cap and don't do it slowly, hot coolant can spray everywhere. While you're doing this, the temperature gauge should not exceed 180 and the heater vents should start blowing warm air, indicating there's coolant in the heater core. If the temperature gauge climbs too high, then you need more coolant or have too much air in the system. Assuming you reach the 10-minute mark successfully, rev it to 2500 RPM for another 5 minutes. During these 5 minutes, now we rev it briefly to 5000 RPM every 30 seconds. This will aggressively force the coolant through the system, in a good way, pressing out the air pockets. After the revving, turn the engine off and inspect the coolant level. Let it cool off and then carefully remove the cap and top off the coolant. Lower the bleeder valve and reinstall the plastic cover. Drive the car normally for 1 or 2 days and then check back in. top off the coolant, and you're good to go. If the temperature gauge reads too hot during driving, then repeat the bleeding procedure to get remaining air pockets out. It's not recommended to go on prolonged drives for a day or two after doing this, so you can get home easily if needed. I did this whole procedure twice, since my system was overdue for a coolant flush. First, I completely emptied the coolant system and the old coolant, and filled and bled the system with distilled water, drove it for a bit, and then emptied the whole thing again and bled the system again, this time using the final coolant mix in a 1-to-1 ratio. We acknowledge that it's a lot of raising and lifting and lowering the vehicle, but leaving the underbody panels off earlier will have let us check for leaks and be thorough. At this point, we raise the Boxster back up, reinstall the underbody panels now that we've made sure there are no leaks, and then lower the car back down. Now that we've checked for leaks and found none, we can reinstall the engine covers, replacing the metal covers first and then the carpets. At this point, we exit service mode. Over the next few days, watch your temperature, watch your coolant level, and top off as needed. And enjoy the additional mileage you've gained by replacing your water pump and thermostat, and the coolant. Thanks for watching.